What if education was never meant to uplift us, but to erase us? What happens when the very system that was meant to educate you is designed to also erase your identity? For many of us, education is seen as a pathway towards empowerment, success, a better life, future jobs, and economic success. Across Africa, colonial boarding schools weren't just places of learning, they were tools of control, breaking generational ties to indigenous ways of life. But this isn't just an African story. The same project of cultural genocide took place here on Turtle Island, also known as North America, through residential schools for indigenous children. And yet, the global struggle for indigenous self-determination rarely includes African people. Why? This video will explore the colonial history of African boarding schools, drawing on Christine Obo's work and her historical accounts that she's been able to share with us through her books. We'll trace the deep connections between these institutions and the residential schools on Turtle Island, and most importantly, ask, why is the world so reluctant to recognize African people as indigenous? What does it mean to be indigenous? And was that identity stolen from us? When European powers colonized Africa, they didn't just take land and resources. They sought to transform and reshape entire societies through the manipulation of our minds. And education became a primary tool for this. Colonial boarding schools were established by European governments and Christian missionaries to train African children to be obedient colonial subjects. These schools stripped children of their languages, indigenous spiritual practices, and imposed European customs as superior. This is still true to this day. Let's look at West Africa, for example. Schools like the Sierra Leone Grammar School and the Salem School in Ghana were among the first colonial institutions aimed at creating a westernized African elite. These schools trained young boys to become teachers, clerks, and low-ranking colonial administrators. But the price was high. Students were discouraged from practicing their own cultural practices and were punished for speaking their native languages. Similarly, in East and Southern Africa, a similar project was underway. Schools like Kenya High School followed the British model of strict discipline and assimilation. Many of these institutions were modeled after elite British boarding schools, where African children were taught that their own cultures were backward and primitive. And yet, despite this intense indoctrination, some of these very schools became breeding grounds for resistance, producing leaders that would later challenge colonial rule. To this day, the continent of Africa is predominantly Abrahamically religious. In some countries, evenly split between Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and newer faiths such as the Baha'i faith and Eastern religions as well. It is no lie that African people are spiritual people to begin with, regardless of Abrahamic religions as a spirituality or our own traditional indigenous religions. When colonizers came and European settlers discovered this about us, they knew that they could use our innate power to connect with spirit, with spirituality as a tool against us. And of course, there's been a lot of resistance throughout, and I'll probably make another video on this as well. But I feel as though that something that has been missing from the conversation is how our boarding schools were a tool of colonization. I've spoken about this with friends who have gone to boarding schools their whole life on the continent, and I hear both sides, as well as I recently posted a video about this on TikTok where people came up and shared their stories about how traumatizing going to boarding school was for them. Now, both sides basically say, one side says without boarding school, they would not have known safety. Boarding school was a place for refuge, and that is understandable. On the other side, you have people who are still living the trauma that is surviving an African boarding school. Both perspectives come together to paint the picture of why and how this was able to become a successful tool of colonization. We talk a lot about colonization as taking land and erasing people from the land. On the African continent, we did not experience the exact same genocide that happened here on Turtle Island. Fear still exists among millions of us, whether that's on the continent or in the diaspora, just by the mentioning of the word spirit, the word ancestor, the word indigenous. An example could be Thames. I love Thames Down, but she posts a photo of her really immersing herself with the waters, dressed in white, and people were like, oh my gosh, she's resembling Oshun. That is the ultimate compliment, in which she responded that no, this has nothing to do with Oshun, but more to do with her walk in Christ and her walk with Christ. In respect to her religious beliefs, of course, being called Oshun is a compliment to your traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge systems. And to feel as though you have to push back and say, this has nothing to do with me, is what the colonizers wanted. For us to no longer want to even speak of or think of ourselves as part of what our ancestors were. Now, going back to the boarding schools. For those that don't know, residential boarding schools were one of the many tools used here on Turtle Island, also known as present-day North America, to separate children from their families and erase indigenous identity on this land. Survivors of residential schools are still alive to this day, still here sharing their stories. Bodies of children that were murdered and died during the residential schools are constantly being found year after year after year in Canada. Seeing the use of education as a tool for erasure, both here on Turtle Island and on the African continent, is a step towards the solidarity that is the missing piece between the two groups. We immigrate to Turtle Island for a better life, for a better future, for safety, for refuge, for connection and proximity to Western ways of life. But what would happen if we immigrated for indigeneity, to connect with other indigenous groups and fight alongside them for their freedom? This is impossible until we recognize that the same tools used against the stolen land that we are on was also used against us. But we're so far removed away from it that recognizing it is something that is so distant and no one wants to talk about, no one wants to touch. It happened to them, not us. We know where we're from. But do we really? I am Ugandan, and to say that I am Ugandan is to say that I am colonized. Uganda did not exist prior to its colonization. We had different kingdoms that took place. I am a Muganda, I'm a Munyankole, and say what you will, but also I'm a Bachwezi person. And so when you read literature about Uganda, it will often refer to it as present-day Uganda because that is what it is presently. The creation of our borders to separate land into Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, Zambia, those lines were not created by us, but they were created by colonizers. To say that I know where I'm from and therefore I am superior to others who've been displaced and don't know where they're from is a lie. Because prior to the creation of the border and grouping Africans into different boxes for Western understanding, Uganda did not exist. I can't tell you where I'm from 10 generations ago. Because 10 generations ago, the borders did not exist, and a lot of the people whom I'm a descendant of were known as nomadic peoples. And this is the story of a lot of people. A couple of years ago, people were taking DNA tests and they were like, oh, I thought I was 100% Somali, and turns out they weren't. The same exact tools used on genocide on Turtle Island and in other indigenous populations and countries are the same exact tools that were used against us. In Christine Obo's book, Personal Education Strivings and Accommodations in Pre-Colonial Uganda, which you can also find on my Arna, or.na, I don't know what it's called, but it's linked in the description. She shares the story of her father and all he experienced during the earlier colonial period. I really recommend this book because it is oral history put into literature. This right here is one of the photos she shares of the missionary schools that held her family members. She shares that the introduction of boarding schools was very popular from the outset of the colonial enterprise. School attendance in 1903 was reported to be 22,000 pupils. The following year, the issue of compulsory education was being considered by the Board of Education and the Anglican Church Missionary Society. The first missionary schools were run on a model similar to the old palace system, whereby children were taken from their parents and exposed to a new language and a new culture. Only now that new culture involved competitive sports such as swimming, steeplechase jumping, running, superseding such traditional games as storytelling, board games, and wrestling. She goes on to share that one of the very first colonial boarding schools in Uganda was Budo. I bet that rang a bell for any Ugandan that's watching this video. The school was initially started to erase culture, not to educate. She shares stories of family members, specifically her father, and his experience in the earlier colonial period. She goes on to talk about how she is not technically Ugandan, but her father was forced to assimilate for his survival. Hi, I'm editing and I forgot to add a really important piece here, which is that in the earlier colonial period, once these missionary schools had began, they had been built all across the continent, specifically speaking of Uganda, citing Christine Obo's book. If you had not converted and if you refused to convert to a Christian denomination, you were refused access to education, healthcare, and other resources. Essentially, everyone had to convert or you would miss out on having access to basic needs and basic rights. You would also be shunned from your family and they would not associate with you because they would then be subject to not being allowed to access education, healthcare, and other resources and rights as well. So as you can see here, it may not have been forceful by chains, by brutality, in a sense, if you look at this specific example, but it was through manipulation and the deprivation of access to care and access to education, leading to people to have no other choice. Not only did you have no choice but to convert, but you also had no choice but to give up your native language, your native practices. In Christine Obo's book, she talks about how her father had to give up his native language, change his tribe, change his association to the tribe that the British deemed acceptable, aka the Buganda Kingdom, the Baganda tribe. I could go into more detail in future videos, leading to the erasure and cleansing of multiple ethnic groups. The name Uganda is a colonial tool of erasure, and that needs to be acknowledged. For that to take place, one of the tools that were used were the boarding schools, were the missionary schools. They were able to use one group of people that the Westerners were able to understand and then use their language and use their culture to then assimilate and colonize everyone else and group them into one. And this did not just happen in Uganda. I'm sure others can relate to the same thing having happened to them across the West, the Central, the South, and other parts of East Africa, such as Kenya and Tanzania. And I bet many people watching this probably do not know that Tanzania is not even its indigenous name. And I may be mispronouncing it, but it's Tanganyika, and I probably sound so Western trying to pronounce it. But again, what I'm trying to say is the names of our countries are colonial projects. Our borders are colonial projects. Most of what we know and believe through the tools of Abrahamic religion are colonial projects. And this isn't to come for anyone who practices an Abrahamic religion. I grew up and I come from an Abrahamically religious household and family and lineage. Because at the end of the day, African people are spiritual beings. We know and believe in a creator. And even if you look back at other historical archives, we were able to preserve our indigenous religions and our indigenous traditions through the brutal force of conversion into Abrahamic religions, and this can be seen across the continent, into other diasporas, into the Caribbean, into North America, and beyond. Other parts of Europe even. Another example is the book of Water and the Spirit by Malidoma Patrice Somé. In his book, he shares his story back to his indigenous roots, and he shared how he ran away from a missionary school, quote unquote, a boarding school that was used to separate children from their parents and force them to become priests and let go of their culture and their traditional ways. I could be wrong, so feel free to correct me. I read the book a while ago and I no longer have it on me. But he was taken around the age of 2 to be groomed into a priest. And through his experience in this school, he experienced a lot of abuse, both physical and sexual abuse, from those that were there to teach him how to become a man of God, and by doing so, erasing his language, his culture, and his traditional ways. He later ran away in his later teens or early adulthood, if I remember correctly, and he just ran. Did he kill the priest? I don't know. I think he killed the priest. I could be wrong. But he did something to the priest and then ran away because that was the only way he could escape the abuse and run away and never come back. He found himself in North America, which he then found himself connecting back to his indigenous ways and was able to see how the stripping of his identity and his culture really took a toll on him. Really recommend that book. He also writes a lot of other books that just are amazing segues into understanding our indigenous spiritual ways of knowledge that have been taken from us, but a lot of us still hold and all of us still have within us. In comparing boarding schools in Turtle Island, in Africa, boarding schools were created to assimilate Africans into Western culture, train a colonial elite, and suppress indigenous identity. Now looking at residential schools on Turtle Island, they were created for the purpose of assimilating indigenous children into settler societies, eradicate native cultures, and to facilitate land disposition. And so how does the role of Christianity come into both of them? Africa. They were run by Christian missionaries who saw African spiritual systems as pagan and forced conversion and religious indoctrination. Turtle Island. They were run by Catholic and Protestant churches enforcing Christianity while punishing indigenous spiritual practices. Another key tool of comparison between the groups is the use of language and its erasure. So looking at Africa, native languages were banned, students were forced to speak European languages such as English, French, Portuguese, and Spanish, and so on. And looking at Turtle Island, indigenous languages were forbidden, children were forced to speak English or French. And now looking at the disconnection from family, children in Africa were taken from their families and placed in distant schools, losing ties to home cultures. And looking at residential schools in North America, indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families, often never returning home. Looking at the key theme of abuse and violence, harsh discipline in Africa, along with physical punishment and psychological abuse, was very common during the earlier days of colonial boarding schools. And now looking at residential schools on Turtle Island, widespread physical, sexual, and psychological abuse and high mortality rates were very common during the residential school period and after. And looking at the long-term effects, loss of indigenous knowledge, cultural alienation, and generational trauma lingers across the African continent in ways that millions of us are still not willing to accept because we are so tied to the new religions that were introduced to us. Again, I am not in a way telling you, do not practice your religion. I believe that one of the driving forces as African people is faith, is a connection to faith, but the recognition that there was something there that belonged to our ancestors too, and we cannot keep demonizing it in the name of Western religions that were introduced to us. The two can exist, at least, But to keep erasing it, to keep being fearful of something that is innately us, is to keep perpetuating the anti-blackness that existed through the tools of colonialism, both on the African continent and in the rest of the world. In looking at the long-term effects of residential schools on Turtle Island, cultural genocide, intergenerational trauma, and loss of land and sovereignty are still prevalent to this day. For as long as we are still settlers on this land, cultural genocide and loss of land is still ongoing. If education is a tool to empower, why were these schools used to strip children away from everything that made them who they were? From Kenya to Canada, the pattern is clear. These were not just schools, they were institutions of forced assimilation. In both cases, these schools were not about education, but about control. They broke the bonds between children and their communities, ensuring that the next generation would no longer identify with their ancestors, but with their colonizer. This is why the fight for indigenous rights cannot ignore Africa. The erasure of African identity is deliberate and continues to this day. But why is Africa excluded from global indigenous movements? This brings us to the next part of the discussion. Who gets to be considered indigenous, and why is it that so often Black people are erased from the conversation? Indigeneity refers to the original people of a land who have historical, spiritual, and cultural connections to it, often disrupted by colonization. By this definition, African people who have inhabited the continent for tens of thousands of years, develop deep-rooted cultural systems, and face colonial land dispossession, are undeniably indigenous. So why is this not culturally recognized? Indigeneity is not just about identity. It's about land, community, and history. It's about people's deep-rooted connection to their home. By that definition, Africans are undeniably indigenous. And yet, when we talk about indigenous struggles globally, African people are often excluded. A major reason of this could simply be anti-Blackness. The Western world has long viewed Blackness as rootless, disconnected, displaced, primitive, backwards. The list goes on. Whether through the transatlantic slave trade, the trans-Saharan slave trade, which is never talked about. And there's an even deeper, more sinister reason as to why this is so. If Africans are recognized as indigenous, then colonial land theft on the continent becomes undeniable. It forces a reckoning with the fact that European settlers in Africa, just like in North America and in Australia, benefited from dispossession, forced labor, and genocide. Here's the thing, the colonial project failed. Across globally, the resistance has only ever continued to get stronger. Across Africa and in the indigenous world, people are reclaiming their languages, land, and histories. Traditional knowledge systems are being revived, and solidarity is growing. That is the crucial missing piece, solidarity. Black and indigenous struggles are connected, whether in the fight against land dispossession, the push to revive indigenous languages, or the demand of reparations. We cannot allow anti-Blackness to divide these movements. Africans must reclaim our place in the global fight for indigenous self-determination, because to be indigenous is not to belong to a land, it is to fight for it. And so I leave you with the question, what are you doing to unlearn colonial education? And how do we come together in solidarity to rebuild what was stolen? Anyways, all I did was yap. This was my first ever video on here. I don't know what I'm doing, but welcome. This is Undoing Mentacide, a project that lives in my heart and is constantly battling with the imposter syndrome that lives in my head. I plan to explore and learn and share as I go. I am a clinical psychology PhD student whose work lies within the intersections of Mentacide, which is mental genocide in a very simple definition. Take with that as you may. The definition is a lot broader and more defined, and I will share that in upcoming videos. I am a lover of learning and a lover of sharing, a lover of land and a lover of rooting. So if you are interested, I do not plan to be as consistent as most people that make videos, so subscribe if you'd like to know when something else comes out. And I am building something on Arna, which I hope becomes a database of folks just sharing information, because Undoing Mentacide isn't just me sharing everything I learn and read and come across, but it's a collaborative process. So as I figured out how to use Arna, I invite you to go check it out and upload educational materials where you can. And yeah, let's grow together. Thank you. Or should I say, hueva leño.